Well, first and foremost, to be clear, we are not in a recession in the United States today. And just taking a step back, a recession is, simply put, just another phase of a business cycle. And it's indicated by 2 successive quarters of decline in economic growth, or gross domestic product. So certainly today, the underlying economic environment as we see it is very different than the previous 3 recessions that we've seen in recent past. Those would be in 2020, the COVID pandemic, which was the shortest recession in history, 2008 Great Financial Crisis or Great Recession, and finally the early 2000s recession, which is commonly thought of, involving the tech bubble. So first and foremost, thinking about the COVID pandemic in terms of that recession and why it's very different to what is stacking up for us today, the COVID pandemic induced a vast drop in both supply and demand. That equated to a 15% unemployment rate, a dramatic stop in services spending, and overall a lack of activity. So as we see it today, coming out of that pandemic, as we've talked about many times in the past, consumers are much more well capitalized. Yes, inflation is starting to wear on disposable personal income, so we do think we will see some shifting spending preferences going forward, as we've already seen this year. But the fact of the matter is, this economic environment is not necessarily dire at this standpoint. We think that economic growth this year will be a little bit slower than we initially thought coming into the year, but not outright negative. And it's important to note that this type of environment, especially driven by consumer spending, which is 70% of gross domestic product, can be sustained for many years at a time. Looking back to 2008, where we find ourselves today as a financial system is dramatically different than we were back in those days. There's much more regulation, there's much more scrutiny placed on the banking system, and in recent stress tests, which are now mandatory every year for the banking system here in the US, we see that we're much more well capitalized in the banking system, as evidenced by high scores on CCAR and DFAST, which are the stress tests that are run by governing organizations here in the United States. And finally, looking back to 2000 and 2001, that recession was very much driven by a euphoric state. And so there are some similarities in terms of the easy monetary policy that led to the run-up before the recession in the early 2000s and what we've just seen in the past 2 years. But the fact of the matter is, there was an explosion in optimism and valuations back in 2000. And what we're seeing today is not nearly the same. We did see very rich valuations in the portions of the pandemic, but that was largely due to the fact that there was no earnings coming into the door of US businesses. So we do see this environment as very different than 2001 because valuations took a very long time in 2001 to get back to average levels. In the US today, we're already below average levels looking at to the last 30 years. So certainly a lot to digest, but we find ourselves in a very different environment today than the 3 most recent recessions.